Welcome to the Hinterland Baptist Unplug and Reset podcast, a podcast all about helping you achieve change and personal growth through our Reset Challenge. The goal? To help you pull the plug on stress, insecurity and depression and replenish you spiritually, mentally, socially and physically. And now your host, Pastor Chris Miller.
Hi, Natalie. How's it going?
I'm pretty good. How are you going today?
I'm doing well, thanks.
That's
good. Well, thanks for tuning in or being part of this. I really appreciate it. That's
not a problem at all. It's actually pretty exciting for me because I'm getting ready for a big year. So, it's perfect timing really for me. So,
cool. Good.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Just to kind of bring you up to speed on what we're doing a little bit, and then we'll talk about what you do and who you are. We are through the month of January. What we're doing is we have an initiative called Unplug and Reset, and each week through January, what we're doing is we are taking each week to talk about a different area of personal health and well-being: spiritual, mental, social, physical, and financial. And today, you and I are going to have a conversation about mental health, which I know is near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, most definitely. I work with people every day in this space. Also, emotional well-being, I think, comes into it because we're a whole person. So, and also the spiritual part of ourselves as well. So I'm fairly holistic in my approach. That's what I love. And yeah, my clients seem to embrace that and seem to get it. So yeah, it's really easy to talk to people about this subject because yeah, you're right. I work with it every day. So yeah.
That's very cool. So what is your business called?
So I'm the founder of Cogni Academy Counselling and Supervision on the Gold Coast, Australia. And I have a Master of Counselling, and I'm passionate about serving women that have experienced abuse and trauma, especially that perinatal trauma. So I'm a Level 3 member of the Australian Counselling Association and part of the ACA's College of Supervisors. So we generally abbreviate or have lots of acronyms in this profession. I will try to explain that as we go. But I work with lots of different groups of people. And here's some more acronyms for you. So there's a thing called the EAP, which means Employee Assistance Program. And so the participants that basically they go to work and their employer invests in their mental health and well-being by employing someone like me to come alongside them if and when they need it, that additional support. So that's really awesome that businesses are embracing that for their employees.
That is great.
So I work with that group of people. I also work with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, so the NDIS, and participants of that. So that's a bit tricky because it's a big beast. The government had rolled this out, but they're really empowering the individual to connect with people like me to support them in their mental health and well-being. But there's a few different people that are part of that. So it's almost like being part of the case of or casework for that person. So there's lots of people that do that. And then just the women and families for PND and PTSD from childbirth. So what I mean by that is postnatal depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. So not everybody's going to have PTSD from childbirth. It usually is defined by a near-death experience. So it's pretty rare, 1 in 50,000 women worldwide. So yeah, it's a bit of a rare one. But I also supervise other practitioners as well. So psychotherapists, sports and school chaplains, spiritual responders, hospital pastoral carers, pastors, and I convene for the Australian Counselling Association, which is a meeting once a month for Gold Coast chapter. So that basically is a heap of us get together who are associated with the ACA, and we do professional development and supervision, so group supervision. So that's basically it.
That's
it's
basically
a lot,
it.
isn't it?
That's a lot. Yeah. You sound very, very busy.
I am. I have my hand in a lot of pies, so to speak, which is one of my supervisors is exactly the same as I am. So maybe I've adopted it from her modeling. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, after you said all that, I feel even more grateful that you've taken the time to do this.
Yeah, thank you. I see it as an investment in your audience. So I think they're worth it, and especially in this current climate that we're dealing with in regards to COVID. So
it's been such a crazy year.
I know, right?
Yeah. Now, we're on a bit of a time frame today. Is that correct? You've got like about an hour. Is that okay?
Yeah, we could go over by about 30 minutes.
Okay.
So hopefully we'll get through everything in that
You got a little bit of breathing room there?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, but
cool.
We'll try to smash it out if you want to.
Well, I thought maybe if it's cool with you, I thought maybe what we could start with is sometimes I know among Christians, there's some different feelings about mental health and well-being. And sometimes a person, they might feel a little bit less spiritual if they struggle with anxiety or depression. But, we look at like the book of Psalms, for instance, and you read stuff David wrote, and obviously he wrestled with that as well. But do you think that that's gotten better over time, or what are some ways maybe that we might be able to overcome that kind of stigma that comes along with that?
Yeah, well, I think the short answer is yes, there's still stigma. So there's still some understanding to gain when we're considering our mental health. And the recent campaigns from other organisations like Lifeline, Beyond Blue, and other big hitters has really improved this understanding. But I don't think we've arrived yet. So arriving isn't necessarily getting to that destination or the goal. It's more about how we navigate. So the values, the morals, the culture, the core beliefs to getting to the destination. So when we begin to overcome, first we kind of connect with self-awareness and understanding. So I talk with my clients about this metaphor called the sailboat. And I like to imagine, and it's from an organisation called Positive Psychology, so it's not my stuff, but it's a really good tool. So I like to imagine each one of us in our own sailboat, so doing all the things that it takes to sail, often through stormy waters of our lives. So this year has definitely been that. And there are certain things we can control, but the waters isn't one of them, and the other sailboats is also not one of them. So each sailboat has a lot to consider and understand, such as self-care, internal boundaries, assertiveness, symptoms of lots of different disorders, but my area is abuse and trauma, levels of healing, etc. But before we can successfully navigate this destination, which would be the goals in your life, some people might reach that certain goal despite the leakiness of their boat, potential threat of sinking the boat, and the stormy waters, which is super interesting to me to discover. And I would put our spiritual self and our beliefs in the boat with us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And sometimes I think people may be a little bit apprehensive or a little bit cautious or even afraid of seeking help. And the fact is we all struggle at times. We really do. What kind of encouragement can you offer to someone who's like, oh man, I'd really like to seek some help, but I'm just not quite able to take that step?
Yeah, I think there's a myth around that seeking help means you're less than or you're not human. But we all live on somewhere on the spectrum of mental health. So what I mean by that is at the lower end, we may be experiencing something as simple as stress, which we know isn't simple, but that's good and bad stress. So healthy and unhealthy stress. Anxiety and depression then would go up from that. And at the top end, we may be experiencing things like psychosis or schizophrenia. So in the middle are things like learning difficulties, brain injuries, psychosomatic disorders, so things that affect our immune system and our nervous systems, but it's also a mental disorder or a learning difficulty. PTSD, bipolar, and anything else we as the helping professionals are still gaining understanding and clarity on. So we're fairly young in this whole spectrum of disorders. But if we as human beings are all on this mental health learning curve, we're sailing the seas of life. It's an invitation to simply discover more about yourself and your relationships alongside someone that's non-judgmental and open-hearted with the clinical and spiritual background to respond appropriately to you, that may just help you understand the different waters of life that you're navigating in this massive ocean that you find yourself in. So we're all in it together. And yeah, often the waters have been murky or stormy. A lot of people that I've talked to this year, that's been the main theme, that the waters just are not controllable and they're very stormy and big and overwhelming.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was reading the other day, and I can't remember where it was now, but I was reading the other day about mental health and study and how the half-life on what goes on in this field is, it actually is relatively short. So you really, like, you talked about all the things you do, but I'm sure something else you do all the time is you're constantly studying and keeping up with all that stuff as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting to me, particularly, about the COVID mental health and wellbeing and the effects it might have on people. Mm-hmm. I'm not a social worker, so I tend to work from the inside out, whereas social workers, I describe it as they kind of gather from the outside and bring it in. So we're very different creatures, but we are alongside one another. But I have a small understanding of something called the thirds of the world and the motivators. So how I've been thinking about COVID is, what might it be for the third of the world that's motivated by self-to-self relationship? What the next third of the people, which is the one-to-one relationship, and that's me. So I'm motivated by one-to-one. And then the final third of people are motivated by one-to-many relationships, so more one-to-group. So through the lens of the thirds, I was thinking about this, and I think people are outwardly focused with the one-to-many group and the one-to-one. So I think it's affecting those people, potentially in a negative way, but potentially in a good way, because pressure isn't always a bad thing. So I was thinking we might be relating to this and adapting to it differently to how it's expected to be affecting us. So I think it's really interesting and growing us in ways that are unexpected. And we're focusing on things like reducing stress and anxiety and depression levels, having awareness of relationships with self and others. And yeah, if it was, or if it is, I'm not saying it is a social experiment, but I'm sure there's many psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, social workers, spiritual responders, psychotherapists, paying particular attention to what's happening. And we're curious about the best ways to respond to people clinically and spiritually in the community during this season.
Yeah, for us, when we've got a great crew of people that really dug in when we first said, okay, you can't meet in person anymore. And we, had to redo everything. And like you say, though, I mean, there are definitely some positives we have seen come from it. One of those is we've got a much larger online presence as a church, for instance, than we've ever had. And we had to kind of learn how to work with people without actually doing it in person. And so, I mean, it's been interesting. It's been a learning experience. It's been fun in some ways and hard in others. But I think overall, I'm completely convinced that when we get to the other side of this, whatever that's going to be or look like, we're going to be better off for it. I really think so. Struggle on the way through, but we'll get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I also teach my clients that the mixture of good and bad stress is actually not a bad thing. It's getting us to that peak performance zone. And a guy in America, Michael Gervais, talked about it in his podcast, and he's a performance psychologist, and he talks about good and bad stress and this thing that military people try to hit, which is the Goldilocks zone, and it's like the peak of good and bad stress. So at the top of that bell curve, that's the Goldilocks zone. So they're always trying to get to that place. So I think COVID could possibly be pushing us to something like a Goldilocks zone in a social setting. Because,
that's interesting thought.
I don't know. Yeah, that's one other thing.
I've got one for you, Natalie, and this one's kind of always interesting to hear people's opinions on this one in particular. But what effect might social media? It's here. It's part of how we live. It's part of who we are now, really, as a culture, as a society. And what effect do you think that may have on people's mental health and emotional health?
Yeah, the influence of all types of media is what I thought of when I was thinking about this as an idea. And I guess that media mountain has been there for a very long time and been building and, adapting and growing. So like most things in life, media can be used for the purpose of good and evil. So I think people need to be discerning, filtering, and discarding the barrage of information that is put out there by those media giants, or even the people that are celebrities and individuals that have a huge following. The mountain of media is changing too because of our access to multimedia devices being more accessible. So the majority of society these days, I guess, we're growing with it. But it causes me to think about different topics, people, places that expand and contract according to society norms. So where my brain went with this is, if I was a social worker, I may be curious about what are the social norms for people these days when it comes to media, and how have those societal norms or expectations changed because of us needing media more in this context of COVID.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. And we're so bombarded with media. I read something the other day that, an adult for the entire day is never out of arm's reach of their phone. And we spend a tremendous amount of time actually just looking at it. There was another stat I heard. We spend like 34 years of our life looking at a screen now or something like that, which is a lot of time, a lot of media consumption.
Yeah. It's definitely concerning in terms of our health and well-being. And that's why I think it's up to the individual to discern and filter and discard the information that's not relevant, or even limit time that they're spending in that space, because I know I'm online a lot of the time now in context for work. I find I'm very, very fatigued at the end of the day because I'm in front of a screen. So it affects us in lots of different ways, but I don't want us to live in fear about having those or having the access to the media and the social context of that, because sometimes that's super healthy to be able to text somebody, for instance, or message them via those platforms, and just reach out to them to connect. So I think, having a healthy level of respect for what you want to get out of it, without that fear. But humanity is a unique and complex beast. And we move individually, and that's as unique as your fingerprint, but no two people are the same. So it's a rich environment on one hand, but it can also, it can isolate you on the other hand. So I guess I've been considering and pausing before responding to anyone on social media. And that's kind of my number one rule that I try to abide by personally. But maybe creating and setting our own boundaries, and the criteria of what's important to us as individuals when engaging in social media is a good place to begin.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Yeah, that's helpful. And the irony of this being another form of media that we're in right now isn't lost on me. But hopefully, this is something that's helpful for people, instead of harmful, as some things can be. But like you say, it's really kind of up to us, I suppose, to filter and decide what we're going to subject ourselves to or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some things, and this is kind of important and going along with what we're doing this month, what are some things that the average person can do to maybe improve and also maintain their mental and emotional health and well-being?
Yeah, great question, by the way. And I think we can all begin with a thing called self-awareness. So when we're aware of something, it's like a light bulb switching on in our brain. So I have a thing called a self-care blueprint that I'd love to give to the audience if they want it. And it just measures different levels of self-care. So it's your psychological, professional, spiritual, physical, all the areas of self-care, as a questionnaire kind of thing. But I call it a blueprint because it kind of gives you a snapshot of where you might be lacking or needing adjustment for whatever reason. So some people can improve their self-care by this step alone because it raises their awareness. So some people will do this exercise and then they'll be like, oh, I didn't even know that was part of self-care. And so also I think the other approach is understanding that sailboat metaphor is another good place to begin on having self-awareness. So when I talk about the metaphor, it's indirectly discussing how you think your life may be going in terms of mental and emotional health. So not all helping professionals utilize this metaphor, but you might want to look to booking in with somebody. I definitely offer like a 1 hour free session for people to just see if we're the right fit. But yeah, I could definitely gift that to you, the self-care blueprint, as a starting point.
Oh, that would be cool. Is that something that's available through your website or
You just jump onto there, and I'll share that at the end if you like.
We can talk about and if people might be interested in making contact with you and maybe meeting with you and getting that self-care blueprint. Yeah, well, at the end we'll put all that stuff up, and so people can get a hold of you if they'd like to. That would be great.
Sure. Yeah, and even other helping professionals like using these types of tools. So I encourage other colleagues, definitely use it if you want to.
Yeah, it is. I like what you say about self-aware, because sometimes we can be in a place where we're really stressed or really worried and not even really recognize that there's things that we could be doing to kind of help us cope with that and deal with it in a good way, a healthy way.
Mm.
Now, how much does your faith play into your practice or come into practice?
Another great question, and I think underutilized superpower. um, so I like to hold space for each individual and their own levels of beliefs, values, culture, and faith.
Mm-hmm.
I have a multi-faith approach, which means I respect and focus on what the person in front of me believes and holds as their constant truth. So for each client, it's different, and therefore I respect each person in that place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like we're co-creating that safe place for them because our beliefs is at our core. So my personal faith is part of the essence of who I am, being open-hearted, loving, and responding to people. But it's more about the person that I'm helping,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. And
Sure.
my personal faith is at the core of my being as well, but it doesn't assert itself when I'm sitting with clients. So in practice, I'm seeking to serve the other by co-creating that safe space, the understanding, the honest place that's right for that person that I'm collaborating with. So this is something I like to reflect on as part of my practice, by asking for feedback after each session and overall, when I've completed a series of sessions with someone or a family or a couple, because it's super important to me to know that I'm sitting with someone appropriately and honouring them.
Cool. Yeah, I appreciate that. And is there maybe a perspective on mental health that is, and well-being, emotional well-being, that is maybe, I don't know, maybe uniquely Christian? Might be a good way
Yeah,
to say it.
there's a few people that I have as mentors, and I've dived deeply into their research and their story and their journey. So I like Dr. Caroline Leaf. She is a CBT neuroscience person who's worked to rehabilitate with traumatic brain injury, which is super fascinating to me and very complex, but I try to distill it down to a simpler place or a metaphor or a working model for my clients and I. And she has a biblical basis to her science, basically. So she backs up everything that she talks about with that biblical perspective. And then the other person that's a bit left field is Graham Cook. He is actually, I think he's an interesting creature, but his perspective to me is biblical mindfulness. So he has this unique perspective on meditation, prayer, prophecy, spiritual responses that speak to people's potentials. And that's what I love about him. So I would draw on both of these models of spiritual and clinical responding that's evidenced by the Bible, but has real life scientific cases that evidence why we want to increase our mental health and well-being. So, yeah, they're the two that I would choose.
Yeah, I've actually read a couple of Dr. Leaf's books. She's great. My wife has heard her speak. Yeah, I enjoy her stuff. It's really interesting to read the neural pathways. I've learned a lot from her. She's pretty awesome.
Yeah, but very, very complex. And I find a lot of it goes over people's heads unless you're diving deep in there and unpacking it for yourself. but yeah, I've been privileged enough to see her speak, I think one of the first times in Australia. And yeah, I've watched her journey pretty closely from that early days when she wasn't as popular as she is now. So yeah, it's been good to watch that.
Yeah. I've got, there's some questions that I've heard people ask, and sometimes, even they come to me with and stuff like that. And one of those is, how do I deal with conflict in a healthy way? And that is a pretty big question, but maybe, you could offer us some help with that. When I do have conflict, whether it be at work or home with family member, the neighbor, whatever, what are some healthy ways to deal with that?
Yeah. And again, I'd like to offer a gift of just a one-page guide on conflict resolution. So I find this is pretty important and a bit of a theme across all types of mental health and wellbeing topics. So I'm offering the guide to help with that topic of conflict resolution. But for some of my clients, they may not like that term even. They might want to know it as problem solving. And yeah, so I'll adapt to the language of the client, because I know some people it strikes fear to the core of them if we say conflict.
Oh yeah.
So problem solving is a bit of a gentler term that I would use with certain clients, or I'll ask them how they want to interact with that. So the one-page guide helps to define and establish ground rules first. Then it explains a step-by-step process to finding resolution from the conflict. And that's a really simple 4 or 5 steps. Actually, I think it's only 4. So it's super simple. And then it provides a framework for moving forward with that process as like a weekly or monthly or quarterly exercise to do with the person that you might be experiencing conflict with. So having something that explicitly helps people have awareness and understand and be guided through a process has proven very, very effective for my client base. There's a deeper, nuanced, specific work that can be done when this basic process is practiced with success. And that's probably when they're working alongside me as a psychotherapist. We'll integrate a few other things into that space so that people can really draw on all the resources available to them. So there's only probably one thing I'd say, or a couple of things I'd say to finish, is compromise is a win-lose. So if we remember that, and negotiation and collaboration are key to remembering that in any relationship that experiences conflict, these 2 things move people towards their win-win. And that was shared with me just recently at a PD with one of my colleagues, Sue Geelan, who founded Metaneo, which she does a lot of work with couples. So this is right in her area of expertise, and she's amazing with conflict resolution. But I kind of distill it down to that one-page guide and then go from there. But yeah, you're welcome to have that as a free resource too.
Oh, that would be awesome. Because I know, let's see, my wife and I have been married, how long? I think it's 28 years this year. I really should know, 27 or 28 years, one of the two. I'm sure she'll straighten me out on that. But we, going through our marriage and starting out, and we learned everything the hard way. And I would so encourage people, if you are struggling with conflict in your marriage or anywhere for that matter, go to someone and get some help. Just a little bit of insight on that can be extremely helpful. It's
most definitely.
Yeah, it can be so helpful, and it doesn't have to be as miserable as it is sometimes. I know we're kind of funny. We made up a couple of simple rules over the years for fighting, and one of them is no name calling, and the other one is we never talk about divorce. And it's worked out pretty good for the most part.
Yeah, there are definitely guidelines to communicating when it comes to conflict resolution. So you're on the right path. Sometimes you just need to go a little bit deeper. The other resource that I know is absolutely incredible in this space is the Gottman Institute. And I think they're on the coast, or you can look up Gottman Institute or Gottman trained psychotherapists or counselors, and they will really help you in that space of definitely marriage. So yeah, it's a really special calling on someone's life to work with couples. I work with families mostly. So when it comes to conflict resolution, I'm unpacking it with a family setting. So sometimes it's husband and wife, but sometimes it's parent to child, or just resolving things really. But the more you resolve things, the happier it is, I think. So it's getting to that sweet spot.
It is nice having a peaceful household for sure.
Yeah. And some people are super motivated by peacekeeping. So that's important to respect.
Yeah, for sure. That kind of leads into thinking about forgiveness. And sometimes conflict resolution may involve that. But what part does forgiveness play in mental and emotional health and well-being?
Yeah, another really good question. So if an individual would like to pursue new levels of spiritual and mental freedom, that's where I think forgiveness and a greater understanding of grace can come in. So other faiths might have different language around this topic. So it's important to value and respect whatever that looks like for a person that we may be responding to. So the main thing to remember is that forgiveness doesn't mean we have to have a relationship with that person moving forward when we're forgiving them. So and that freedom of choice comes in, and the free will and the boundaries also need considering when we're approaching forgiveness. I had to do this really massively when I was in my teens, because my parents divorced when I was 6. So I'm self-disclosing a little bit here, but I think your audience could handle that. But yeah, I guess I had to hit the issue of forgiveness big time in my teens and figure out what level of freedom I wanted mentally and spiritually. And when I learned that, yeah, it really did give me new freedom. So that's what I think it equals.
Yeah, I think forgiveness, when I've talked to people about forgiveness in particular, I think one thing that people sometimes misunderstand about forgiveness is forgiving someone's not saying what they've done is okay.
Yeah.
And that's often, I think, something that we might get hung up on or confused about. It's not saying that it's okay. It's just, it's really, the forgiveness is really for the person doing the forgiving, isn't it? I mean,
I
it's
think so.
for their well-being. Yeah. As much.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're kind of letting yourself out of that captivity of bitterness and emotional turmoil is how I see it. So someone's in the mess of all that emotional turmoil, and when forgiveness comes in and there's an understanding of that and it's really connected with, then the person just opens their own captivity door, really. And so that's why I'm saying it's freedom, because sometimes we really need to get out of that captivity in order to move forward and embrace life, and even just have different levels of understanding of someone that's different to us. So there could be a world of hurt driving that person that you're forgiving, but it really, it changes things, because it's like you come out of that blind spot and you're able to take those blinkers off and, yeah, just find a different level of freedom and safety, I think.
Mm. Yeah. And I know in my own life, and I'm sure for many people, that forgiveness is a process almost. I can't just say, well, I forgive you and necessarily have the benefit of it. It's a process that has to be worked through as well, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely cyclic. So I think we spin around the cycle of forgiving and grace and boundaries often. That'd be at the core of a person, I would think, who is really focusing on self-care and really wanting to understand themselves better and their relationships. So, yeah, it speaks to a lot of different things, especially when it comes to violence. And I would even say grief and loss is part of this. So, yeah, I don't want to open that up, though, too much.
No, I understand.
But, yeah, I think there's a lot to it. It's not just the cookie cutter once and you're done. It's definitely a cycle, like you're saying.
Yeah, that could be a few podcasts in and of itself, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Could talk for days.
Yeah. I remember back to my first year in seminary, I had a professor there that had the class memorize Philippians chapter 4. And I never really came to grasp why until years later. But there in Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, Paul says, well, think on these things. And he talks about things that are good and pure. And this may go back to Carolyn Leaf a little bit now that you brought her up. That's kind of cool. What effect does what we think about, how does that affect who we are, mentally and emotionally? What kind of effect does that have on us, what we think about?
Yeah, another great question and pretty deep. But a lot of the time it seems we're having an internal battle of our minds. So the mind, will, and emotions, I like to group that as the core of who we are. And it's identified or termed as the soul. So when I talk about someone's soul, I'm talking about their mind, their will, and emotions with them. So if we think something to be true, our brain does not hold prejudice and we just believe it. So neuroscience and research and the work of Dr. Leaf explains that. And she says if we think on something for 21 plus days, our brain creates a good or bad thought or learning pattern. So this is part of her geodesic information processing model, which is technical talk for something that's way more complex than how I'm distilling it with you now. But basically, it's the understanding of how this may begin to form the essence of who we are. Or that's my takeaway from her research. So I also like explaining to people about an interlocking doors concept that was created by Craig and Jan Hill. They run Family Foundations International in the States. I think Colorado they're based, but they also have a branch in Australia. And so people, when they're understanding the interlocking doors concept, can begin to understand relationships held between their own spirit, their soul, which is their mind, will, and emotions, and their body. So the concept basically helps us understand that we're a complex creation. In nanosecond timing, there's this information highway of our body, which is our cells, our tissues, our muscles, and our flesh, that transports our 5 senses to a myriad of responses, mainly between the body and soul, firstly. So then if we allow the soul and the spirit to communicate, we're closing off the door to the body and soul and opening up the door to the soul and the spirit. And then that can happen vice versa. So that's how the interlocking doors concept comes in. I'm not sure if that's easy to understand without a visual, but hopefully I've done what I can to explain that.
Yeah.
But we can begin to understand the interlocking doors concept when we're noticing exactly what is happening for us internally. So this then helps us close off the door between the body and soul, which tends to be, I think the ratio of heavy lifting is like an 80-20% ratio, which I learned the other day, and I thought, my goodness, the body is 80% of that communication, and only 20% the soul is doing. But I like to think of it as, if we're using the interlocking doors, we're balancing up that relationship between the body, the soul, and the spirit. And the spirit, in my opinion, is our superpower, like I said before. And that's something we can always learn to help us soothe and regulate, which is part of spiritual practice like meditation and prayer. They speak to our nervous system. So, yeah, I just think, it's so complex, but we can view it in a simple way to just get our minds about what's happening and also how to navigate that moving forward.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thing, and how, those things that we think and how we're connected, and we're different parts but the same person. It is very interesting. And I had a few people wanted me to ask a few different questions here, as we're kind of heading towards that the end of our time. But one of them was, what daily habits can you establish to overcome anxiety and keep mentally strong? Because I know a lot of people deal with anxiety, and to very different degrees, but it's something that a lot of people deal with. So what daily habits can you establish to overcome anxiety and keep mentally strong?
Okay. I've been working a lot in this space recently, because a lot of people that are coming to me have different levels of anxiety and depression and stress. So the first thing and the greatest thing to do is self-soothe and regulate techniques. So I can share that with you, but they're not going to have a visual.
That's all right.
But one of the ones I love the most, and it's the simplest, and I do this with kids a lot, it's your right hand, and you're just basically, Chris, you can see me, so you can see what's happening, but just get some clarity if you need. But it's your right hand, and your thumb is out like an L, and you're going to place it under your left arm and just sit it there. And then the left hand can just rest on top of the other arm. It's kind of like you're giving yourself a bear hug, but you're not squeezing. You're just sitting there.
Okay.
This is a very brilliant way to self-soothe and regulate your nervous system. And immediately my tone of voice changes. I slow down. I'm breathing better. I don't know. How is this for you, Chris?
That's interesting. It's fascinating how that works, how something like that can change your demeanor and the way you even speak. So yeah, just kind of a self-regulation technique. That's cool.
Yeah. So sometimes I'll sit in the room with my clients and model this to them, and they will copy me and mirror that, because that's part of our nervous system and our brain wanting to mirror somebody else's nervous system. So that's a really helpful thing too. So if you're feeling anxious, get around someone that's calm. My husband is a massive peacekeeper. So I'll go and just sit with him if I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed. That works too. So yeah, they're just a couple of ideas, but I go through a few other techniques like dropping anchor, which is the acceptance commitment therapy technique.
Mm-hmm.
Your audience could look that up if they wanted to. And then there's a few other ones that are more like just regulating your body so that it tells your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system to interact and communicate. And your parasympathetic is the one that rests and digests.
Mm-hmm.
And your sympathetic is the one that fight, flight, freeze, collapse. So we want to kind of switch one of them off and switch one of them on. So when we're self-soothing, regulating, we're switching on the rest and digest parasympathetic part of our autonomic nervous system, if people want the technical term, which they probably don't. But it's always helpful just to understand that.
Yeah. Sometimes we're like, I don't need all the technical stuff. I just want to get control of this anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully those couple of easy ones at the beginning of when I started talking about this, those self-soothing, regulating things can definitely at least reset the nervous system.
Yeah, thanks for that. And another question we had was, how do you deal with negative emotions?
Yeah, so this again is a bit of a tricky one. So it's like we need to have awareness of them first. So we need to identify them. So sometimes clients will come and they're having trouble to even identify what is happening for them in terms of their negative emotions. Then I would move them to a place of embracing and inviting that process or the processing of the emotions, even if they're negative, is more helpful than trying to exile or push away the negative emotions. So I really love Peter Levine's approach, which talks about titration, which is giving yourself tiny little doses of the negative emotion over time and learning to tolerate that and embrace that. And then pendulating is when we swing violently between those negative emotions, but we're wanting to pendulate back to the middle ground, which is usually your meditative, spiritual, core beliefs self. And again, I'm distilling this down to a very simple concept, but that's the basis of it. So I'd say embrace negative emotions or learn to.
Yeah, sometimes I guess they can have a larger effect almost when you try to fight them and push them away than if you just kind of accept them, like the acceptance and commitment therapy you're talking about.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. And I think exiling the part of yourself that is actually a signal to you, it's a sign that you need to respond to yourself. So it's sometimes we're releasing that negative emotion because it might be something like our body needs to cry to release, or our body needs to respond, because our body will eventually keep the score of all that negative stuff. So that's something that Bessel van der Kolk talks about when he talks about trauma. Our bodies do keep the score.
So those kinds of things over time can kind of build up. Is that?
Yeah. And we need to actually respond. So we need to, definitely when it comes to trauma, the big thing is learning to respond in a way that just swings between those things, because we can't exile it. We need to learn to embrace and identify them. That I'm talking about massive, big problems that occur or symptoms that happen out of trauma. So they're super negative emotions.
Okay. Yeah. Another question that came up was, what do you tell your brain when you're in a slump? I know that there are times when we probably there's probably times that everybody feels that loss of passion and maybe a little bit stagnant or discouraged. And people wonder, okay, what do I do when I'm in that kind of a situation? So what can someone do to help themselves?
Again, I really think this is a sign to reconnect with yourself. Sometimes what that means is reconnecting with beliefs, values, culture, and identifying your purpose, your identity, and maybe the calling on your life. So that's where I would go if I'm working with someone.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because I suppose what gave you your passion and motivation in the first place would have been those very things that you talked about, and reconnecting with those would be a very helpful thing to do for sure.
Yeah, and potentially redefining it sometimes.
Yeah, redefining. That's great. It's something else we need to do occasionally. And we've got one more question for you before we wrap things up. How can you break the pattern of dwelling on the past?
This one's super easy for me.
Oh, great. Cool.
Because even if someone has trauma, we don't have to recollect, or we don't have to go there again. We don't have to re-traumatize someone. So this dials back to where we began with the questions from other people, and it's self-soothing and regulating, mindfulness techniques like colouring in, doing your hobby, also working with a helping professional like me that utilises cognitive behaviour therapy, solution-focused therapy, and integrative approaches that can help accelerate things like your awareness, your understanding, and moving you pretty much from point A to point B instead of trying to tough it out and do it all on your own without the support.
Yeah, having that support is very helpful, something we need. So again, Natalie, I'm so thankful. I know we're at about an hour already. It just flew by. It goes so quickly. But before we wrap up, are you taking on clients, or is that something you're doing currently?
Yes, I'm actually rolling out my very, very special Transform from Trauma membership package. It's super affordable, and I'm also working with private clients as well. So it depends if you're the right fit for either one of these things. But the starting point for all of it, and the free resources that we've talked about, is if you go over to my website, which is cogniacademy.online. So that link, I guess, could be put in the show notes. I'm not sure, but definitely I'll get that to you so that you could do that. Cool. Otherwise, people can simply just pick up the phone and call me, and we can have a conversation as a starting point. Or I'm on Instagram, which is at Aussie Counselling, and that's spelt the Aussie way, which is counselling with 2 L's. So I've noticed that a bit of an anomaly, because I have a lot of people from the States interacting with me for supervision. So I know we spell things differently, and that can be hard to translate.
Autocorrect gets me on that one all the time. I'm always wrong, whichever way I pick, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So if for those people that have experienced abuse and trauma, particularly that near-death experience, and want to continue their healing journey with support from me, you can register your interest in my one-to-one Transform from Trauma Masterclass is the starting point. And again, I'll send you the link, Chris, if that's okay.
Yeah,
and
please
then
do.
You can
That'd be great.
Pop it in the show notes. No problems.
That would be awesome. Yeah, you send me that stuff, and people can go to your website and have a look at those resources. And you're on Facebook as well. If I'd like to follow you there. And
I have pages that they're just separated into Supervision and Counselling, because I found that it was too tricky to try to amalgamate the two. So I've separated it to Aussie Counselling and Aussie Supervision, just so that there's some clarity around that.
Awesome. Well, Natalie, I think we'll pull up there if that's all right with you. And I'm super grateful for taking the time. I know you're obviously very busy and you're also very insightful, and we certainly appreciate it. And I'm sure a lot of people will benefit from it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to people about this topic. And I wish you all the best for future podcasts and whoever else comes after me. But it's been a delight, and I'm really happy to have shared all that I have.
Oh, cool. Yeah, maybe we can do it again someday and talk about some of those things that we'd like to get into more.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. No problems at all.
All right, Natalie. Well, thank you so much. And have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the year. And hopefully we'll get to talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much for listening in today. You can find out more at hinterlandbaptist.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. A special thanks goes out to our team of volunteers who makes this podcast possible. I hope you found it helpful, and I will be praying for your health and well-being. Have a great day.